Alrighty, guys, welcome back. This is going to be part three of the Black Plague presentation. In this section, we're going to be looking at the social effects of the plague. Okay, so let's get started, guys. All right, so our essential question for today's lesson is, what were the social effects of the Black Death? So, how did the Black Death affect society during the Middle Ages? How did it affect people and larger societies, like entire cities and in all of Europe, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so the very first thing we have to kind of think about was the worldview of the people of the Middle Ages, how they viewed the world. And that was one that was really religious. So you guys remember us kind of talking about how religion and in particular Christianity really kind of became the dominant force of Europe during this time period, right? So we switched from the old Roman ideas to Christianity, right? So people became very religious. So the way that they reacted to the Black Death was that they they really became more religious, even more religious. They really thought they viewed the plague as being like a punishment from God, right? And in order to be cured of the plague or to not get the plague, they really believed that you had to ask for forgiveness, you had to become more religious, and you had to take your religion more seriously, right? So as if Europe was not already really religious, they became even more religious. Many people did, right? This is evident in the last presentation when we kind of talked about the flagellants. I don't know if you guys remember that, how people would kind of go around, they would go around whipping themselves as a way to ask for forgiveness, as a way to kind of punish themselves for their sins, right? So if you can imagine, these people would really religious people would travel from town to town practicing this self-punishment, this flagellance of whipping themselves to ask for forgiveness, and they would try to get people involved in this and try to get other people to kind of ask for forgiveness. Okay, so another way that it impacted society, and this is kind of the opposite, kind of like a really interesting thing, is that others just kind of gave up on religion. They said, well, everyone is dying around me, so guess what? I'm just going to party like it's the end of the world, because they really did believe it was the end of the world. So they're like, forget it. I'm just going to party. I don't care. I'm just going to party, which is really, really interesting, right? It's like the opposite thing. Now, I want you guys to kind of think about how this is kind of similar to some of the things that we're seeing today with COVID-19, right? There was a couple of videos released not that long ago of young people saying, "I don't care. I just want to. I want to party. I'm not gonna let coronavirus mess up my spring break." So it kind of reminds me a little bit of this attitude, right? We're just gonna party. It's the end of the world, and there's nothing we can do about it. Okay. One of the darker ways that affected society was that many innocent people were blamed for this disease, and this is something that we're seeing a little bit of today too, right? So during the Middle Ages, Jews were blamed, right? So you can see from these pictures, Jews were in many places asked to show that they were Jewish by wearing like an obligatory badge, right, or a specific like a hat to identify themselves as being Jewish, and this was to kind of to distinguish themselves so that people can point at them in a discriminatory way, kind of blaming them for this disease, right? So why were the Jews blamed? Well, let's take a look at this. Jews were blamed because Jews actually got sicker at a lower rate than the rest of the European population. So where Christians were getting sick, like very frequently, Jews were getting sick at a lesser rate, at a lower rate. And this caused people to believe that, hey, maybe the Jews are behind this. Maybe the Jews are doing something to the Christians because they don't, uh, they have something against us, or they're plotting against us, right? Or they're evil, or whatever they may think that was the case, right? But that wasn't that wasn't the case at all, right? Let's take a look at the reality, right, of why they actually got sicker at lower rates. These are really important points. So Jews actually lived in separate communities from Christians. right? They lived amongst themselves, right? In many cases. Um, and Jews were known to keep cats as pets. And these cats would actually chase rats away, which we know were responsible for carrying the fleas that would infect people. So having those cats actually helped protect the Jews. And another really important thing too is that Jews actually practice better hygiene because of their religious practice. So in Jewish practice, it was required to clean yourself a little bit. Hygiene was considered part of the religion, right, or part of the practice, where you had to cleanse yourself more than was required, like in from Christians, right? So that was why Jews actually got sicker at lower rates. Had nothing to do with them causing anything, right? And again, we're kind of seeing some of this play out today with COVID-19. Innocent people are being blamed. Some Asian Americans were being targeted. I saw in the news the other day, right? So again, this is a really sad kind of byproduct of these pandemics, right? Where everyone's kind of freaking out. Okay, and then let's take a look at some of the more creative ways that affect society, and that is in art. So I wish Mr. Conway was here to kind of talk about this, but let's take a look at some art pieces from the Middle Ages. Here, guys, you can see that the themes behind these art pieces, these are actually art pieces from the Black Death era. Death was very prevalent. So you can see here that, these art pieces. Bring out today! Hush you. Bring out! So these art pieces had a lot of death portrayed in them, right? This kind of like this end of times, right? So there was an obsession with death with these art pieces, and they're really cool. I mean, for any of you guys who are just kind of like into skulls and into just kind of like, you know, really cool art like that. I know a lot of skateboard art uses skulls, obviously, right? This is really cool stuff. All right, so let's take a look at a really powerful quote that I feel really kind of captures the era, right? The sentiment of this era. And feel free to use this quote in your essay. This is a quote from Giovanni Boccaccio, who was a writer during the Middle Ages. And his quote, this is a very powerful quote. He said, "The victims ate lunch with their friends and dinner with their ancestors." So think about that for a second, right? What is he saying? People were eating lunch with their friends, but dinner with their dead ancestors. Kind of a freaky, kind of scary thing, right? And that is because the mortality rate in Europe during the Black Death, sorry, was 35 to 70%. We don't have a hard number because we didn't really start keeping count until much later in history, but it was estimated that up to 35 to 70% of the population in Europe actually died of this disease. So roughly about 25 million people, which is huge. Okay, now this is a lot different from the mortality rate that we're seeing today. Obviously, there's a lot of people dying from COVID-19, but it is nowhere near where it was during the Black Death time period. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the other effects, maybe some of the positive effects, right? So, maybe we can ask, was there any positive results from the Black Death? Was there anything positive that came out of this horrible disease? And the answer is yes, there was. Okay. The positive that came out of this disease, the Black Death, was that it destroyed the feudal system. It destroyed feudalism. Okay. And the way that it destroyed it was that it declined the workforce. Okay. So kind of stay with me for a second. Okay. So if the workforce declines, right, all those people that are farming the land, right, there's not going to be enough people to farm the land and to do the work of everyday people, right? So that meant that manors would collapse, right? These big manors where all this food was grown, right, and distributed would collapse. Agriculture declined, right? So this system right here, where everyone's relying on the peasants, right? The knights, the nobles, and the kings are relying on the peasants, gone, destroyed, right? Because now we don't have anybody to rely on to work, right? Because those people are dying at high rates. So what that means is this: the workers were actually able to demand better pay and working conditions, because now that there's less workers, right? There's less workers now, so that those few workers now have the power to say, "Oh, you want me to work on your manor? Sure, but now you have to pay me more because nobody else is going to do it. Okay, I'm one of the few workers that can do it, so now you have to pay me more." Okay, so that's the way it kind of worked. And oh, by the way, I also want better rights. I want some days off. I want more rights. I want less to work, less hours in a day. So, because of this, workers were able to demand better pay and working conditions. Okay, and this helped cause a middle class in the Middle Ages. Okay, a new middle class. So instead of everyone either being really rich or really poor, or the few rich, I should say, and the many poor, now we have more and more people that were able to get into the middle class, to have better pay and have a little bit of extra money for themselves. Okay, and of course being able to demand really important things like rights from the king, which was going to be kind of like the next era in history where people start to really question the power of the king and question the few rights that they have. Okay, all right. Another really important thing that happened is that people started to really question the authority of the church and the kings, right? So we know that the church and the kings had controlled Western Europe. Okay, that after the Black Death, that was thrown into question. Like people started to ask, do they have the authority to rule over us, or should we form a new type of government? Right? Hint, hint. Right, and then this is kind of where we start to rediscover in history these old ideas that kind of disappeared. The Roman and Greek ideas are going to start to make a comeback. Right, they make a comeback in this next era in history called the Renaissance. And Renaissance just means rebirth in French. For my Spanish speakers, Renaissance, when you think of the word Renaissance, in Spanish it would be renacimiento, Renaissance, rebirth, right? And Renaissance it was meant just the rebirth of the Greek and Roman ideas that had disappeared during the Middle Ages. Okay, and this was going to be a time period now where people became more educated, wealthy, and where art and science flourished. Okay, an age of reason was about to begin. Okay, and that, in essence, caused was a positive turn, right, from going from the Middle Ages and so much death and destruction to something positive in the Renaissance. Okay. All right, guys. So that is it. That is part 3 of the Black Death. Hopefully, this information helps you guys out with your essay. Okay. Stay tuned. We're going to do a Venn diagram on comparing COVID-19 to the Black Death. Okay, guys. Thank you so much for listening.